All right, let's get started. It's the top of the hour. I'm Marcy Winograd, coordinator of CODEPINK Congress. Great to be with you all, and my co-host Medea Benjamin, and our guests talking about taking Israel and Biden to court. We will feature tonight Catherine Gallagher, a senior staff attorney with the Center for Constitutional Rights, as well as Marjorie Cohn, international law expert, former president of the National Lawyers Guild. Before we get started, however, I just want to invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat, where you're from, anything that you want to share that you're working on. And then we're going to go to some news updates with Medea, who's been on Capitol Hill, with Ann Wright and others working really hard overtime, advocating for a ceasefire in Gaza. We will also just remind ourselves of the norms, and that is that, yes, we want to introduce ourselves in the chat and also always be respectful. We can disagree agreeably, right? And if anyone feels the urge to troll, well, we might just show you the door. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about court cases against Israel and Biden, and the precedent for this, as well as the definition of genocide under the UN Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. I know that a lot of us are engaged in protests of one form or another, and the situation, we're all seeing this genocide in real time. It's a horror show. We hope that this will end soon, but Israel is now basically carpet bombing the South. People have nowhere to go in Gaza. The latest news is that Secretary of State Blinken said today that he's going to revoke visas or not give visas to settlers from the West Bank, as well as some Palestinians, anyone involved with violence. Al Jazeera is reporting a dire situation with deaths mounting there. And we read that a declaration, Putin will be visiting Saudi Arabia, the UAE, with Israel and Hamas on the agenda. People in the West Bank are fearful that massacres are awaiting them as well. It's grim. Medea, tell us some good news, something on Capitol Hill. What's happening?
Well, I don't want to sound Pollyannish because it's a pretty miserable situation in Congress, but there are now about 60 members of Congress who are calling for a ceasefire. And those of you might remember when Cori Bush initially did her resolution, it was 18 members. They haven't signed on to her resolution, but they have put out their own statements or signed on to something else. And where you can see that is, I put it in the chat. I'll put it in again for those who just came on, so that you can see who are those members of Congress. And I think it is important that all of you do those calls constantly, and those of us who have been able to be in DC actually going to their offices, it is having an impact. And the other thing that we're seeing is all of these great dissenters that are inside the halls of power, whether it's staff working in Congress who have signed letters anonymously because they don't want to lose their job, but then doing a press conference, or the over 1,000 people at the Agency for International Development who signed a letter, or people who have resigned from the State Department. Wherever you look, there are people who are dissenting within the government, and that is very exciting. And I don't know if we're giving something away, but we just met a intern from the White House who said that 40 of them are putting out a letter tomorrow, interns in dissent. So it is very exciting to see that kind of splitting in the halls of power. And of course, we know that within the movement, there's just such amazing protests everywhere, all over the country, every single day. So that's the exciting news. And I also think it is important to recognize that while there was this week-long truce, there were 105 hostages who were released. There were 210 Palestinian prisoners who were released. It's not enough. But it does show that when the bombing stopped and the talking began, that there was progress. And that's why we just have to keep the pressure on to call for a ceasefire. And of course, with the $14 billion poised to be on the Senate floor any day now. We have to just keep hammering away that we don't want any money going to Israel, but if they insist, at least it be conditioned, and that's what Bernie Sanders is promoting, and other members of the Senate, as we go around to their offices, are saying it's not going to be in the final bill, but it's the beginning of showing that there is daylight between U.S. policy and Israel. Thank you.
Thank you for that update, Medea. Yes, we know that the House passed the $14 billion in weapons for Israel, but it's stalled in the Senate because they weren't going to go with cuts to the IRS that the Republicans in the House were insisting upon. Biden, in total, he is asking for $105 billion, more $60 billion for Ukraine, $14.5 billion for Israel, billions more for Taiwan and for policing the border. So what I'm hearing is that this package, I don't know if it's going to be cut up, attached to the military budget, or voted on separately as supplemental. But what I'm hearing is that it probably won't be voted on till next year.
Let's hope. And you had asked me for good news, Marcy, but I must put mention some really bad news, which is today they quickly voted on this resolution 894, which explicitly says that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's so disgusting. And the fact that there were 311 members of Congress who voted for it and only 14 who voted no. There were 109 who either voted present or didn't vote, but only 14 voted against that. And
this is in the House, right? In the House. That's
in the House, and it's extremely dangerous that passed by such huge numbers.
Exactly.
But you also ought to mention that Jerry Nadler, who is a supporter of the state of Israel, he said, this is not what we should be passing. This bill is not what we should be passing. It is very inaccurate. It is not something we should pass. And for Jerry Nadler, who has been calling for the death and destruction of Hamas, and we heard him in a press conference that was by the leadership of the House Foreign Affairs Committee with family members who still have hostages, who have family members that are hostages. And Nadler was very, very strong. We got to destroy Hamas. He didn't quite say we have to destroy Gaza, but for him to come back and say this type of resolution is not what we want is a little bit of light. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And I'm sure our attorneys who are joining us tonight will have something to say about this, because, people can say, the earth is flat. That doesn't make it flat, right? So Congress can say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but it doesn't make it so in a court of law. And it'll be interesting to hear what they have to say about that. I also want to just encourage people, because we aren't all in Washington, D.C. We live wherever we live. But where we live, there are city councils, there are boards of supervisors. And I urge you to go to them with a ceasefire resolution. That's what we did today in Santa Barbara, California, on Chumash land. Push. We've got to really push. And they, in turn, need to push our House representatives and U.S. senators. With that, let's get started and greet our guests. Our first guest is Catherine Gallagher. She is a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. Catherine works on universal jurisdiction and international criminal law cases involving U.S. and foreign officials, and torture and other war crimes, and civil actions involving private military corporations, torture at Abu Ghraib. On November 13th, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a lawsuit against President Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin for complicity with genocide. Welcome, Catherine Gallagher. Great honor to have you with us tonight on CODEPINK Congress.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So I think I'm going to be speaking to you for a little under 10 minutes about this lawsuit that the Center for Constitutional Rights had the privilege to file. I just want to acknowledge the moment that we are in and the horror that continues to face Palestinians in the occupied and besieged Gaza Strip, and especially the fear of all of those families, children who had been displaced from their homes in the north, who've been under bombardment for weeks, and now are facing bombardment and just a constant attack in the south of Gaza. As colleagues and friends of ours in Gaza often say, as Raji Sarani says, there is no safe place in Gaza at this moment. So in speaking to you today, it is very much in an effort to try and end the horror that so many people are living under. Over 2.3 million people are living under right now in the Gaza Strip. So as was said, on November 13th, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a lawsuit in the Northern District of California against 3 of the highest level US officials, including President Biden, on behalf of 2 Palestinian human rights organizations, Defense for Children International Palestine and Al-Haq, which is the oldest Palestinian human rights organization, as well as 8 individual Palestinians, 3 of whom are currently in Gaza, one of whom, Dr. Omar, is at the El Najjar Hospital, which we have been hearing a lot about today. And then 5 Palestinian American plaintiffs who have family in Gaza right now and who have lost combined a total of over 115 family members that they know of at this moment. So we filed this case, and it's a genocide case. And I've been at the Center for Constitutional Rights for 17 years filing lawsuits, and this is the first time at CCR that I have been involved in a genocide case. I've worked on Palestinian rights for all of those years, but this moment, genocide is the correct word to be using. And I'm going to speak in a very high level because I know Marjorie is going to come in after me and speak with more detail, but I'm going to outline the obligations on the United States and these 3 US officials and why it is that we found, that they have breached their obligations under customary international law and should be held to account and to a change of action by a federal judge. This is a lawsuit for declaratory and injunctive relief. We are seeking a change of action by the United States at this moment. So I'll speak about the legal obligations, and in so doing, I have to speak broadly about the unfolding genocide that is happening in the Gaza Strip. So as was mentioned, there is the Genocide Convention, which is the Genocide Convention to Prevent and Punish Genocide. And so there are 153 signatories to that convention. And this Saturday is the 75th anniversary of this convention, which came after the horrors of the Holocaust. And because of the gravity of what was seen in World War II across the globe, and particularly with the Holocaust, when the Genocide Convention was drafted, there was a built-in obligation, a duty on states to not only punish people after the commission of genocide, but actually an obligation, a duty on states to prevent genocide. And that duty is particularly there for states who have the ability to influence countries when there is, quote, a serious risk of genocide. And the International Court of Justice, as I'm sure we'll hear from Marjorie, has weighed in on this duty to prevent a number of times in recent years. And that obligation, that duty to take all measures within a state's ability, kicks in again at the moment that there is a serious risk of genocide. So the United States, which as many on this call I'm sure are aware, since the founding of the State of Israel, has provided a massive amount of financial, military, and political support to the State of Israel, more than $250 billion. And right now we are in the midst of a 10-year aid package where Israel is getting $3.8 billion a year. And this is aside from the 14.5, which is being discussed. There is also a stockpile of over $4 billion worth of weapons in Israel. And Israel has access to weapons that no other country does from the United States. And it's able to acquire weapons in a different way, much more directly and without conditions, as again, many on this call I'm sure are aware. So the United States has that influence over Israel because of its strong and unparalleled military links to Israel. It also, of course, has given political support and political cover to Israel. That includes at the Security Council, where it has either blocked or actually vetoed resolutions, and including at places like the International Criminal Court. And I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that from Marjorie. So what does it mean then that there is a serious risk of genocide, and when should the United States have started to take measures, which it did not take? That serious risk was there already on October 7th. What we have heard over the last 60 days, and especially in the first weeks, and it's been repeated since, is genocidal intent from Israeli officials. And these are not just any Israeli officials. This is the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Energy, the President. They have made promises to literally, quote, wipe out Gaza. They have called Palestinians, the 2.3 million people who live there, human animals. They have used dehumanizing language. They have promised an unprecedented bombing campaign. They have, as you know, imposed a total siege on the Gaza Strip. And they did so with an announcement of, quote, no food, no fuel, no energy, no electricity, no water. And then, as Israeli officials say what they mean and do what they say, they instituted that total siege. And they did so while ordering an evacuation, a forcible transfer of the population from the north to the south. This was not a measure for safety. It put people at severe risk. It allowed for the bombing, even more bombing of civilian homes in the north, but it was also people were being bombed as they fled from the north to the south. And the infrastructure in Gaza has been destroyed with schools, houses, bakeries, hospitals, as we know. The health infrastructure has been just decimated. So what do these things mean when you look at the definition of genocide? Genocide is two parts: the specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a population based on their nationality, their ethnicity, their religion, their race. And it is carried out by underlying acts, including, but certainly not limited to, killing. That is one way, and it's one that we're quite familiar with when we think of genocide. But another underlying act of genocide is deliberately creating the conditions of life to destroy physically a group in whole or in part. And that is what has happened, and what was announced already on October 9th by the Minister of Defense, with that total siege of no water, no fuel, no electricity, and the continual bombardment, and the bombing of infrastructure, of sewers, of water supplies, again, cutting off of all the basic necessities for life. So when you see together that genocidal intent, that specific intent to destroy, that was announced by senior Israeli officials, and then carried out through actions of the killing, the creating conditions of life to destroy the group, and the imposition of severe physical or mental harm, you have the elements for genocide. So the United States has been on notice since October 7th, and certainly since the announcement of the total siege on October 9th. And instead of taking all measures within their ability to influence and change the behavior of Israel, they have rushed weapons, they have sent military advisors, they have sent JDAMs, they have sent precision-guided munitions. They have continued to enable the bombing and the siege on the Palestinian population of Gaza. So what our lawsuit filed in California alleges is, in the first count, is that President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin have failed in their duty to prevent genocide. And because instead of taking measures to prevent, they have actually taken measures to assist, we say that they have also committed complicity in genocide, essentially aiding and abetting genocide by sending weapons and other forms of support. So our complaint is on the Center for Constitutional Rights website. It's 85 pages, and it lays out the facts of Israel's unfolding genocide, the legal obligations on the United States, and the actions that these three senior officials and the Biden administration have taken. We call again for injunctive relief for the court to order certain actions to stop the United States from fueling and furthering the genocide, certainly to call for a ceasefire, to open the borders and end the siege, and to do so now. So we will have the government's response this Friday, which we will put up on our website, ccrjustice.org. We will be filing our response on December 22nd, and we're currently scheduled to have a hearing in the Northern District of California on January 26th. And I just want to very much commend the Palestinian human rights organizations and the individuals who in this moment of such extreme horror and such a moment of fear and heartbreak took this measure, calling on the United States, calling my government to really change its behavior and save lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine Gallagher, Senior Staff Attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. And I appreciate the point you made about we have a duty to prevent. And I think that prevent genocide, I think that's a message that we need to take to all of our elected officials at every level, right? All right, with that, we're going to turn to our next guest, and Medea will do the introduction.
Well, I have the great honor and pleasure of introducing the wonderful Marjorie Cohen, who is a professor emerita, former president of the National Lawyers Guild, lectures throughout the world on international human rights and U.S. foreign policy. She's testified at military courts martial about the illegality of the wars, the duty to obey lawful orders, and the duty to disobey unlawful orders. Her recent article, Self-Defense and the Right to Resist in Palestine, refutes the Israeli government's claim that its assault on Gaza is justified as self-defense. So thank you so much, Marjorie, for being with us.
Thank you, Medea, and thank you, Marcy, and thank you all for inviting me, and thank you, Katie, for your incredible work at CCR. Such an important lawsuit. I'm going to talk about genocide, of course, but I just want to mention that the forcible transfer of the people in Gaza is a crime against humanity. I'm writing about this as we speak, and it's a second Nakba. Israel is trying to ethnically cleanse Gaza, push them out first from the north to the south, now from the south to they have nowhere to go. There's no words to describe the horror of what's happening there. I'm going to talk about holding Israeli and US leaders accountable in the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice and tell you what the difference is. The Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, provides for the prosecution of individuals who commit or aid and abet the commission of genocide. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, or the World Court, which is the judicial arm of the UN system, resolves disputes between countries. It is not a criminal tribunal that prosecutes individuals. So that's the difference between the ICC, a criminal tribunal, and the ICJ, which resolves disputes between states, between countries. Accountability for genocide in Gaza should be pursued in both the ICC and the ICJ. Israeli leaders should be indicted for the crime of genocide, and US leaders should be indicted for aiding and abetting genocide in the ICC. The Rome Statute defines genocide the same way it's defined in the Genocide Convention, which Katie has explained. In 2021, Fatou Bensouda, then chief prosecutor of the ICC, announced the opening of a formal investigation into war crimes committed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, during and since Israel's 2014 so-called Operation Protective Edge, which killed 2,251 Palestinians. Following a 5-year preliminary examination, Bensouda had found a reasonable basis to believe that Israeli forces had committed the war crimes of willful killing, willfully causing serious injury, disproportionate use of force, and the transfer of Israelis into Palestinian territories. Bensouda also found there was a reasonable basis to investigate possible war crimes by Palestinians, including intentional attacks against civilians, using civilians as human shields, torture, and willful killing. But in spite of the 7-year probe into the situation in Palestine, the ICC has made no significant progress toward holding Israeli leaders criminally accountable. In March of this year, a little more than a year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Karim Khan, the current chief prosecutor of the ICC, announced that the pretrial chamber had issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin for war crimes in Ukraine. The chamber also issued an arrest warrant for the Commissioner for Children's Rights and the Office of the President of the Russian Federation for the same war crimes. Well, while the US government celebrated the arrest warrant against Putin, it has pressured the ICC to refrain from prosecuting Israelis and Americans. And there is, of course, a double standard in the ICC's treatment of the situations in Ukraine and in Palestine. It only took a year to actually issue arrest warrants, whereas this investigation of the situation in Palestine has been going on for more than 7 years. Although neither Israel nor the US is a party to the Rome Statute, the ICC has determined that it has jurisdiction over crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territory, including the Gaza Strip. The Rome Statute provides that an individual can be convicted of genocide in the ICC if he or she aids, abets, or otherwise assists in the commission or attempted commission of genocide, and that includes providing the means for its commission with the knowledge of the unlawful purpose. And as Katie explained, the US is providing billions of dollars, heavy weaponry, and technical assistance and political and diplomatic cover at the UN for Israel's commission of genocide. Certainly, without those things, Israel could not be committing the genocide against the Palestinian people. Now, even though Israel is not a party to the Rome Statute, the ICC prosecutor visited Israel and Ramallah on December 3rd, and he issued a statement condemning Hamas for its egregious breach of fundamental principles of humanity through the taking and continued holding of children. He also decried the significant increase in incidents of attacks by Israeli settlers against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. But he did not criticize the Israeli government for its genocide in Gaza, including killing thousands of Palestinians, bombing civilian infrastructure, and forcibly transferring what is now 80% of the population of Gaza. Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor, made a vague statement that Israel's response to Hamas's attack is subject to clear legal parameters that govern armed conflict. Conflict in densely populated areas where fighters are alleged to be unlawfully embedded in the civilian population is inherently complex, he said. But international humanitarian law must still apply, and the Israeli military knows the law that must be applied. That's it. That's all he said. Israel knows better. There needs to be international pressure applied on the ICC to prosecute Israeli and US officials for genocide and aiding and abetting genocide in Gaza. Now, 150 states, that is countries, have not just signed, but have also ratified the Genocide Convention. That makes them parties to the Genocide Convention. Any one of those 153 states can and should be urged to report Israel's genocide to the ICJ. Now, if that happens, and if another state party, such as Israel, the US, or the UK, disputes the claim of genocide, then the ICJ is required to adjudicate the responsibility of a state for genocide. If the ICJ makes a finding of genocide, then the ICC doesn't have to determine that genocide has occurred. The ICC would just have to decide which individuals are responsible for the genocide. It's not clear why the Palestinian Authority has not invoked the Genocide Convention, but many people know on this call, I'm sure, that the Palestinian Authority plays both ends against the middle when it comes to Israel's oppression of the Palestinians, and is not highly thought of at all, in fact, to the contrary, by the Palestinian people. Several countries, including South Africa, Bangladesh, Bolivia, Comoros, Djibouti, Colombia, Algeria, and Turkey, have all urged the ICC to prosecute Israeli officials. Other countries that have been critical of Israel include Pakistan, Brazil, Chile, Belize, Jordan, Chad, Honduras, Bahrain, Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba. These countries should be approached to refer the matter of Israel's genocide to the ICJ. And if one of them did make a referral and Israel contested it, then the ICJ would have jurisdiction to hear the matter. And its decision would be binding, and it would go to the Security Council for enforcement. The Genocide Convention was invoked against Serbia by Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the ICJ ruled against Serbia about the massacre at Srebrenica. This fed directly through to the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia's prosecutions, and the same thing would happen if the ICJ were to make a ruling that Israel was committing genocide. That would feed into an ICC prosecution. In 2004, the ICJ issued an advisory opinion against Israel in the case involving the barrier wall it built on Palestinian land. There's another advisory opinion case pending in the ICJ regarding the legality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory, and the ICJ is expected to rule against Israel in that case. You've probably gotten the notion that the ICJ is an objective body. It has expert judges from all over the world. It is the judicial arm of the UN, whereas the ICC has become a real partisan tool. From the US for 50 years helped to craft the Rome Statute, but as President Clinton was leaving office, he signed the Rome Statute. Again, that's not a party, that's not a ratification, but he suggested to George W. Bush, the incoming president, that he not send it to the Senate for advice and consent to ratification. Well, not only didn't Bush send the Rome Statute to the Senate for advice and consent to ratification, in an unprecedented move, John Bolton, his right-hand man, we know about John Bolton, who hated the UN and everything else, unsigned the Rome Statute, took the US signature off the Rome Statute, then blackmailed 100 countries who were parties to the Rome Statute with these bilateral immunity agreements, saying if you turn over any US officials to the Hague, to the ICC in the Hague, then we will withdraw foreign aid from you. In other words, blackmail. And then the Hague Invasion Act, which Congress passed, saying that if any American national was sent to the Hague for prosecution, that the US could use military force to extract them. And the US has done everything it can to undermine the Rome Statute and the ICC since then. Donald Trump placing sanctions on the prosecutor, on a lot of the officials. Biden fortunately removed those sanctions, but the Biden administration has done everything else it can to undermine the ICC. So the ICC and the ICJ are very different bodies. They have different functions, and we must support the efforts of the Palestinian human rights organizations to pressure the ICC to prosecute Israeli officials for genocide. And we must use all of our connections to prevail upon countries that are critical of Israel to refer the matter of Israel's genocide to the ICJ. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marjorie Cohn, international law expert. That's a lot to digest. You gave us a lot of information, and I'm sure we'll have a number of questions for you. Medea, would you like to start?
Well, yeah, some of the questions, I guess, I'll put a couple of out there. Katie, there's a number of people who really want to know, can they, and would it be helpful to attend the hearing in the district court in January? And is there anything else that people can do to be supportive? They also asked if you considered adding Jewish groups to make the lawsuit broader. And for Marjorie, there were some questions about other people that could be sued. Of course, this could be for either of you, but can Palestinian Americans sue anybody in Congress if they lost family or any administrative officials? And is it legal for people? And what about people in the US who have served in the IDF? Is there any way to hold them liable? And lastly, for Marjorie, what about the Leahy law? Why isn't that invoked?
A lot of questions. Who would like to begin?
Katie, maybe you could start us out with
Sure. Just to start on the hearing on January 26th, that is currently scheduled as a video conference only hearing, which means that we won't have a courtroom to go to, but we'll see if that changes. The good news is, though, that it should be then available to everyone to watch, including people in Palestine. That is our understanding, but we are seeking clarification of that. So we recently got that instruction about the hearing. But if it is one that you can attend, we will certainly be putting information out on our website. So I would recommend continuing to follow on ccrjustice.org. In terms of amending the complaint to add others, I have to say we also had this question from many Palestinians in different parts of the world and here in the United States. And because we are moving very quickly in this case, seeking a preliminary injunction, this is the case at this point. But we do welcome any kind of support, and that could be in the form of educating the public and your members of Congress and others about the legal obligations that we put forward in it. It could be writing an op-ed, it could be writing a letter to the editor. We also could see, in terms of the timeline that we have, while it's not typical, there could be the possibility of submitting amicus briefs. So again, that's not typical in a district court case, but that could be something because we have seen a great deal of public interest from many asking us how can they support this case. So, you know, please do reach out. And I think that might be where the questions for me ended. I'm happy to come back with a second round if there were more.
Great, thank you. And Marjorie?
Yes, any individual can be sued in the International Criminal Court. Charges can be brought against them. It doesn't have to just be leaders. Could be members of Congress who have appropriated money, aiding and abetting the genocide. And the same goes for Israeli Defense Force members. They can be sued as well in the ICC. But the prosecution has to bring those lawsuits, the prosecutor of the ICC. That is not, they can certainly be urged to do that. But it's not likely that that's going to happen. Katie might be able to talk more about lawsuits that can be brought domestically against, for example, members of Congress by Palestinian Americans who have lost family. In terms of the Leahy law is basically two statutory provisions prohibiting the U.S. government from using funds for foreign security forces where there's credible information that they have committed gross violations of human rights. This is on the books. It is a law that can and should be used. Has it been used? No. And it has not been used for the same reason that we see almost no pushback by any president, by any significant number of people in either house of Congress against Israel. The sacred cow. You don't criticize Israel. If you criticize the Zionist regime, you're anti-Semitic, and the corporate media is just rife with this bias that I'm sure everybody has noticed. But that doesn't mean that we don't keep struggling and fighting. And for example, Biden's numbers have gone down among youth who supported him because they see that genocide that's going on. They see what's happening in the media, and they don't like it, and they're not going to vote for him. But it doesn't seem to faze him or the DNC. I don't quite know why.
Thank you so much.
And just one more question
Sure.
was in there. Is it legal for Americans to serve in the IDF?
That's a good question. They do. I don't know if it seems to me there's some kind of prohibition about serving the armed forces of another state. And maybe these people have joint US Israeli citizenship. That's probably what it is. If they're Israeli citizens, then that might I would have to research that. It's a good question, Medea.
Thank you. And I know a few of you have your hands up. Please post your questions in the chat. Medea is checking the chat to see what you want to know. I have a question I'd like to follow up on this thought about suing your own congressperson for funding the weapons, the 2,000-pound bombs that are creating 40-foot craters filled with rubble and corpses in Gaza. Has there been any consideration of preparing a document which people could sign on to? I don't know if there's anything like a class action, something like that, where we could let our Congress members know that we plan to sue them should they continue to fund this. Also, there's a lot in the weeds about the International Court of Justice and the ICC and the different types of advisory and other actions the Court of Justice can take. If you could review just briefly, how we can really support an effort to ensure that there's some more heat on Israel for this genocide, maybe beginning with the International Court of Justice.
Well, I'll take that one. And it really is a question of getting at least one of those 153 states parties to the Genocide Convention to bring this issue of genocide committed by Israel in Gaza to the ICJ. Not one of those 153 countries has done that yet, including the Palestinian Authority, which does not necessarily represent the interests of the Palestinians. So if anyone has contacts in any of those countries, and some of the countries that I mentioned, some of the countries that have been critical of Israel, in contacts with people in the government, leaders of those countries, to try to bring pressure to bear, or petitions or articles or op-eds, that's something that we could do. But I think that the most, certainly, even the corporate media can't sanitize what Israel is doing in Gaza. It's all over. It's in our face all the time. And that has done more than anything, really, to change a lot of people's minds. I mean, there are some people who are just dug in, but it certainly has changed some people's minds. But I can't underestimate the importance of op-eds, letters to the editor, not hard to get published, keep them under 150 words, peg them to a news story or an editorial. And if your letter doesn't get published, they count up how many letters there are from each perspective, and it will help other letters get published. So, and of course, CODEPINK in coalition with other organizations does tremendous work. And so, keep doing what you're doing and do more of it.
And thank you so much, Marjorie. And what about this thought about how we pressure our own Congress members with any kind of legal action for aiding and abetting genocide?
Yeah, suing members of Congress is not the easiest thing to do because of certain immunities that they have in relation to their legislative duties. That doesn't mean it can't happen, And it also doesn't mean it can't happen somewhere outside the United States in a court that doesn't operate under the US Constitution, but instead operates under principles of universal jurisdiction and customary international law, including countries that many of the 153 countries that have domesticated the prohibition on complicity in genocide. So I think that it's not that there aren't legal routes, but I would say at this moment, the better route and the more effective route is to bring the case of the United States, of which they are a pillar as an elected branch of government, and the obligations on the United States, and call on them to uphold the duty to prevent genocide and to not be complicit in genocide. So we see the executive branch actually carrying it out, and we are calling on the third branch, the judicial branch, to be the backstop to ensure that this very crystal clear legal obligation is upheld. And I would note that we drafted this complaint taking into account jurisprudence out of the International Court of Justice. This is a complaint that could be picked up by any one of those 153 member states and brought to the ICJ for both liability of Israel and liability of third states who fail in their duty to prevent. And it likewise could translate down the line into, I saw someone mention the Alien Tort Statute. It could translate down the line to damages actions and other lawsuits. Right now, the urgency we are pressing is to try and stop the killing, stop the siege. There will be so much accountability that we are going to continue to need to see, and not the impunity that we've lived with for so long. I saw someone else mention the Dichter case that CCR, I was a part of that, filed for the El Daraj so-called targeted killing back in 2002, and we lost that on immunity grounds, foreign official immunity grounds. We need to break this cycle of impunity, and we will be having more lawsuits, whether in US courts. I'm a legal representative for victims at the ICC. We will continue to press there to ensure that the Assembly of States parties and other member states know that we do not accept a double standards ICC. We need to see an ICC that gives justice for all victims. And when we have an unfolding genocide with UN special rapporteurs and working groups, and the kinds of warnings that we have been hearing week after week, with death counts rising, including over 6,500 children, we need to break this cycle of impunity. So whether it's a lawsuit against a member of Congress, I'm not sure, but we need to make sure they are carrying out the obligations right now and stop sending weapons. And that, I saw another question in the chat about weapons companies. That is a place where I also expect to see lawsuits happening. We already see them in the Netherlands. We see them in the UK. I think we'll be seeing them here in the United States. I think we'll be seeing more cease and desist type letters going to weapons companies that in this moment, with the knowledge of how the weapons are being used, continue to send them. And when you have knowledge of an ongoing crime and you aid and abet it, you send the means to commit it, you are then liable for aiding and abetting a war crime, a crime against humanity, or even complicity in genocide, depending on the level of your support. So there is more than enough liability to go around. And right now we need to use all efforts, all measures that we can to try and impact the pressure points. And we are starting with this case at the highest level with President Biden.
Thank you. Medea, did you want to ask a question? I have plenty.
Yeah. If I'm just going to throw these out there, some that were in the chat, and you can answer whatever you want. Maybe we could start with Marjorie. So how do we get AIPAC to have to register as a foreign agent? And of course, people would love to sue AIPAC as well. There's another issue about Karim Khan, and because he is so biased, is there any way to do a campaign against him? CODEPINK has had a petition out, but is there something that we could do with other states or something more effective to get rid of him. And then there was a question about mobilizing a UN peacekeeping force. How does that happen? Who at the UN has the ability to begin that kind of a process? And so those are some of the questions.
Yes, I think there would have to be a challenge in court to APEC registering as a foreign agent. This was an issue in the Cuban 5 case. It was a straw man issue, but it made life miserable for them. I think that would have to be challenged in court. In terms of Karim Khan, a campaign against him, I don't think that there's any way to get rid of him, but certainly there could be a lot of pressure put on him. And I think that petitions are a very good thing. Of course, large numbers of names could have an impact. And in terms of the UN peacekeeping force, that's in there, that's in the UN charter. It sounds good, but keep in mind the UN peacekeeping force in Haiti had, fulfilled a very, very destructive role. They actually were acting as repressive and brutal police against the people of Haiti. They brought cholera to Haiti. So I don't know. It would have to be very clearly delineated, defined, who was in charge of it and who was part of it. I don't know that is realistic at this point, although certainly something has to happen to stop this genocide. All avenues must be pursued.
Katie, do you want to add anything to those?
No, I'll leave those there for the moment.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. I have 3 questions. One is, can you share with us the procedure against Pinochet and how that unfolded, which court and so forth? And the Leahy law, is there something procedurally that a congressperson could do? Let's say somebody who serves on the House Armed Services Committee or Senate Armed Services, to begin, start the ball rolling, because we have this law that's completely unenforced. And then I think, Catherine, you mentioned cease and desist orders to weapons companies. Is that happening? Can we help with that? Thank you.
Yes, I mean, for legal organizations as well as for groups to write to weapons companies, I think is something that can be done and maybe is being done at this point, pointing out their legal obligations to respect and protect human rights and their obligations to not be complicit. One of the cases that CCR litigated and unfortunately lost was the Caterpillar case. And in that case, part of Caterpillar's liability was, again, because it had knowledge. It had been told from years and years of activism by letter writing campaigns of how its bulldozers were being used to destroy Palestinian homes and sometimes destroy them with people inside, injuring and ultimately killing a number of Palestinians and also Rachel Corrie. So letter writing campaigns to the companies on an individual basis or an organizational basis is certainly something you can do. And it can be in very broad strokes what the legal obligations are. And there are an increasing number of human rights organizations focused on business and human rights. And so you can join up with some of their efforts. And again, I would point to what's happening now in the UK and the Netherlands. In terms of the Leahy law, from my understanding, there are certain limitations to the Leahy law, like so many laws when it comes to Israel. Processes of compliance and checking, they're loose or non-existent when it comes to Israel. So I think in this moment, again, with the group on this call, there need to be fundamental shifts in the way weapons are sold and delivered, frankly, as I would say none should go. To the extent that there will be any that continue to go, there need to be conditions. What we've heard again and again, as recently as 3 days ago from the United States executive branch, is that there are no conditions and there will be no conditions on weapons transfers to Israel. And that is complicity. when the US knows how these weapons are being used and continues to send them without any conditions, that behavior at this point is unlawful. So to take this horrific moment and build in some of the changes, as you mentioned, between the ceasefire resolution and talking Congress now about conditions, it needs to be even stronger so that those checks and balances that should be there apply to Israel.
Thank you. And the Pinochet case?
The Pinochet case was a universal jurisdiction case. Pinochet, of course, a dictator in Chile, who ultimately, there was an effort to bring him to justice in Spain by Baltasar Garzón back in the late 90s, when there was amnesty and immunity and impunity at home. And so the idea of universal jurisdiction, which was captured in his case, is that there are some violations that are so bad and so universally condemned that you don't need the traditional links, whether it's your nationality or the fact that the crime occurred there, for a country to act and hold that person accountable. So when Pinochet traveled to the UK, there was an arrest warrant issued by Spain, and they brought Pinochet to Spain and for crimes that had happened in Chile. So this idea is something that we had tried to use against George W. Bush for a number of years for the US torture program in various courts around the world. And there were also cases brought by Palestinian human rights organizations about 15 years ago for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And unfortunately, we were not successful. But what we have seen in the last decade is a number of universal jurisdiction cases for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even for genocide in places like Syria and elsewhere. And so there are more. There was just a conviction last week out of the Gambia that happened in a German court. So with these precedents, it's going to be harder, I believe, for these national courts to not also hold US officials and Israeli officials without truly exposing the double standards. If they want to have respect for the rule of law and claim that they are providing justice, they need to provide it for everyone. And that's what I mean when I say I think we will be seeing a lot of cases as events continue to unfold, but certainly after we get in place the most urgent thing needed, which is a ceasefire and the end of the siege on the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza.
Thank you so
Can I
much.
add something to what Katie said?
Oh, yes, and absolutely.
Yeah, on the Pinochet case, he was arguing that he had immunity, absolute immunity, as a former head of state. What does that remind you of? Immunity, former head of state, Donald Trump, maybe. At any rate, the UK denied that claim, but it went on for so long that eventually Pinochet was so ill that there was a decision made that he was too ill to stand trial. And so he never did face justice for his crimes. In terms of universal jurisdiction that Katie mentioned, Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, was tried, convicted, and hung by Israel under principles of universal jurisdiction, even though Israel did not have any direct connection with his crimes at the time. And so universal jurisdiction is based upon the fact that certain crimes are so atrocious, they're crimes against all of humanity, and any country, even countries without direct connections with the issue, are competent to punish them. So universal jurisdiction is very, very important.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask everybody to unmute and thank our guests, Marjorie Cohn and
Thank you,
Catherine Walter.
Marjorie.
I
Thank
know we all have
you.
a lot of
Thank you
questions.
so much.